Hey friends, it's Pastor Scott. We are talking about life groups and our small groups having a big impact. If there's one story in Scripture that when people think of a small person that had a big impact, it had to be that story of David versus Goliath. I mean, that has become part of sort of the lore, not only of Scripture, but even in popular thinking about, you still talk about it's a David and Goliath scenario when the odds are totally against one side and they come out on top. And so that was the passage that Pastor Tim was preaching on for us this last week, right out of 1 Samuel chapter 17, the story of David versus Goliath. So that will be something that you'll be reading about in your group, is looking at that story. But let's kind of unpack a little bit of what's going on there. It is a very interesting story because we find that here is Saul that is in charge of the armies of Israel, and they've come out. But on your handout tonight, you're going to notice there's a small map there that actually shows that when the Philistines were camped in the valley of Elah, it means that they were right on the road that led right to the Judean hill country. Normally the Philistines were out on the flatland, the Shephelah, and they could kind of patrol the flatland pretty well because they had chariots with iron wheels. Well, the chariots didn't do so well up in the hill country. That's where the Israelites were. They were shepherds, so being in the hills, they were really good at that. So that kind of border sort of kept them apart. The people of Judah, the people of Israel, they've got the hill country. The Philistines, they're out in the flatland where they can use their chariots. But now the valley of Elah is on the borderland. That's up in the foothills. So the Philistines are on their way, which means the next stop, they were only about 6 miles from Bethlehem. And then they're only about 5 miles from Jerusalem. So they're getting very close to some of those very important cities, which is why Jesse, the father of David and his brothers, was very concerned and sent David out to check on the battle because he knew that his home was right in line if the Philistines were to invade. The other thing that we find that's kind of interesting is this whole idea of Goliath coming out and challenging the armies to a one-on-one champion combat. The Israelite army didn't know what to do. They were not used to this kind of battle, but that's where it's interesting to understand that the Philistines had this background of coming from Greece and the areas of Macedonia. So if you'll remember your Homer and the battles in the Trojan War of Paris versus Achilles, one-on-one, winner take all, that's what Goliath was doing. So in your reading tonight, you'll have a chance to think about that. But the most important thing is here how David had faithfulness, that God was going to bring the victory. He was going to deliver Goliath and the Philistines into the hand of the armies of the living God. That is one of the cool things in this story where David says, "Who is this Philistine that he would challenge the armies of the living God?" Because as Goliath was proclaiming the names of his Philistine gods, David recognized, no, there's only one true and living God. So tonight you'll be reading from 1 Samuel 17 and thinking about some of those things. But in doing so, we're also going to be thinking about how God works in our life. One of the reasons we get together in these groups and encourage one another is that we find spiritual health. It's one of the reasons we did the inventory to begin with, and we think about a rule of life, is to not only grow closer to God so that we know God, but also so that God, by His Spirit, can heal us and bring health and growth into our life. We talked about this in our groups last year, of that there's really 3 things that we need to be healthy in our life. The first is to have a really deep sense of our own value and worth and significance. We find that for David, his value and worth came from knowing God. And we find that even written into the Psalms that he writes. He knew that God was the one that was watching out for him and that he was made in God's image. So that was very important in this story. His trust and his faith was not in his own abilities, but in what God was going to do as he showed faithfulness and obedience to the Lord. The second thing is that we also have a sense of dealing with our own identity and our past, coming to grips with who we are and really living out of that and being right with ourself. And then also being right with others, being able to give and receive love with other people. And built into all of that is the ability to receive the love of God. So when we are right with us and God, with us and others, with us and ourselves, we're able to live in a healthy, viable place, and we actually find flourishing coming into our life. That's how we become spiritually healthy, emotionally healthy, relationally healthy in our relationships, which is one of the biggest goals of these life groups, is that we find ourselves living in health. So tonight, as we think about David, it's not just going to be a cool story where we think about how a giant was defeated against all odds, but we're also going to think how this relates to us being healthy in our relationship with God, with ourselves, and with each other. So get to your reading, look at the questions that we have as we invite God to bring us into a healthy relationship with Him, with others, and with ourselves tonight. God be with you.